There are over 1 million engine failures already logged in the UK in 2026, and most of the people whose engines are on that list drove past every warning sign without knowing what they were looking at. That is the situation. Not a prediction. Not a worst-case scenario buried in a manufacturer's risk assessment. A current, documented reality being reported by mechanics up and down the country, from independent BMW specialists in the Midlands, to Land Rover rebuilders in Scotland, to Ford workshops on every high street. The numbers are in from 24,650 real UK engine replacement quotes, processed through the last full calendar year. And the picture they paint is one the manufacturers would very much prefer you did not see clearly. 4 failure types account for the bulk of it. Timing chain at 18% of all failure-related quote requests, diesel particulate filter at 15, turbocharger at 14, crankshaft at 10. That is the shape of this crisis. It is not random. It is not bad luck. It is the same handful of design decisions, the same stretched service intervals, the same cost savings made upstream by somebody who knew exactly where the bill would end up. Which is with you. I have spent a long career pulling engines apart, and what strikes me about this moment is not the scale. Engines have always failed. What is different now is that a significant portion of these failures were entirely avoidable, and the people sitting with 5-figure repair bills had no idea the risk was there. Some of them owned the car for years, serviced it on time, did everything they were told. The thing I want you to pay attention to, and I will come back to it specifically at the 4th engine on this list, because the story there is uglier than almost anything else I have looked into this year, is who decided what you needed to know, and when, and why the answer was not you. There are 8 failure types worth understanding in detail. By the end, you will know which engines are sitting on the most dangerous ground, what the early warnings actually sound and feel like, and what a repair genuinely costs at an independent, versus what a main dealer will quote you for the same job. That gap, in some cases, is enough to buy a decent second car. Let us start at the top. The BMW N47 timing chain is, without question, the most cited engine failure in the UK. The N47 was fitted across most BMW 4-cylinder diesels from 2007 to 2014. That means 1 Series, 3 Series, 5 Series, the 118th, the 120th, the 318th, the 320th, the 520th. It remains the most notorious diesel engine on British roads, and it has financially ruined otherwise solid cars. A timing chain, in case this is new territory, synchronises the crankshaft and the camshafts. The bottom of the engine and the top. They have to turn in perfect relationship, because the valves open into the cylinders at precise moments, and the pistons are rising into those same cylinders at precise moments. Get that relationship wrong by a few degrees, and you have bent valves, cracked rockers, metal through the top end. Get it wrong fast enough, and you have all of that at once. The N47 chain can stretch or snap, typically between 60,000 and 120,000 miles. On this engine, the primary chain drives the camshafts, while a second chain drives the diesel pump. When the main chain stretches, the tensioner can no longer hold correct position, and the guide rails wear through. Now, here is what makes this a BMW problem, rather than a generic timing chain problem. The chain sits at the back of the engine, hidden behind the gearbox. Replacing it means separating the gearbox from the block. BMW knew where they put that chain when they designed the car. It was a packaging decision to keep the engine compact. A reasonable engineering choice with a very specific downstream consequence. What would be a morning's work on most engines becomes a job that runs 30 to 45 hours of labour. The failure records describe a poorly designed chain tensioner and guide rail system that could not withstand long-term stress, especially with extended oil change intervals or lower quality lubricants. my reading of the histories, and I want to be clear, this is my interpretation rather than stated BMW policy, is that the combination of rear-mounted chain and underspecified tensioner created a failure window BMW understood well before owners started arriving at dealers with engines that would not start. Unlike belts, chains are meant to last the life of the engine. The N47s fell short, often between 60,000 and 100,000 miles. In a country where diesel 3 Series models were the default company car and the default high-mileage commuter, that became a national headache. BMW never issued a full recall, though goodwill contributions were made case by case. On the money. A preventative replacement at a good independent runs from roughly $1,000 to $1,900 depending on gearbox type and whether X-drive adds complexity. Chain failure usually destroys the engine and you are into a $4,000 to $6,000 rebuild. One main dealer quoted $3,800 to replace the chain alone, leaving worn guides and sprocket untouched. That is the institution supposed to be looking after you, quoting a partial fix that will need doing again. One well-known UK specialist reports replacing 6 to 12 N47 chains per week and has been doing so for over 5 years. That number had a weight to it when I first read it. By the way, if you want to keep your car running for as long as possible without wasting money on unnecessary garage bills, I put together a guide called the 500k Mile Car Care Bible. It covers 101 habits that can help your car last longer, the warning signs you should never ignore, and how to spot unnecessary repairs and garage upsells before they cost you a fortune. To get your copy, just scan the QR code on screen with your phone's camera, or use the first pinned comment below. 6 to 12 a week from a single workshop. This is not a fringe problem. It is a steady, predictable stream of damage from a known design. The early warning is a cold start rattle. 1 to 3 seconds of rattling when you first turn the key, then it clears. That is the slack chain slapping the guide rail before oil pressure builds and the tensioner takes up. It quietens once warm, which is exactly why people dismiss it. Do not dismiss it. Before the next engine, let me tell you where this is going. The DPF story and the Volkswagen chapter are connected in a way that, if you drive or have ever driven a VW Group diesel, is going to make you uncomfortable. Hold that for item 3. And there is a Land Rover failure at number 4 for Discovery 4 and Range Rover Sport owners that is a different category from everything else here because it arrives without warning at motorway speed, and the main dealer's answer to it is an insult dressed up as a quote. The diesel particulate filter. 15% of UK engine-related quote requests. DPFs became mandatory on diesels in 2009 under emissions legislation. The filter is a ceramic honeycomb in the exhaust that traps soot before it reaches the tailpipe. When it works, you never notice it. The car periodically gets up to motorway temperatures. The filter reaches around 600 degrees. The soot burns off and you carry on. The failure mode is almost always the same. If the filter cannot burn off its soot, it slowly clogs. Performance drops, fuel use climbs, lights appear, and the engine starts protecting itself by cutting power. The DPF was designed around an assumption that diesel drivers mostly do longer journeys. Short journeys kill these systems. Regeneration needs the exhaust to hold high temperature long enough to do the job. A 15-minute school run does not do that. A 20-minute commute does not do that. Millions of UK diesel owners bought their cars partly on economy figures only achievable on motorway runs, then used them for exactly the short urban trips the filter cannot tolerate, and the mismatch was nobody's problem until it became the owner's problem. Replacement runs $800 to $3,500 or more depending on the vehicle. Cleaning is $150 to $400 and resolves most issues at that stage. Forced regeneration for mild clogging comes in at $85 to $300. The difference between acting on the light and ignoring it for 6 months is the difference between an $85 garage visit and a 4-figure replacement. If you own a diesel and you are mostly doing trips under 20 minutes, I want to be honest with you. That filter is slowly dying. Not today, not next month. But the ash load is building faster than the regeneration cycles can clear it. And at some point, you will be in limp mode on a roundabout wondering what just happened. Now, the Volkswagen chapter, because the DPF failure rate across VW Group cars has a cause that goes beyond short journeys, and it traces to something VW did, was caught doing, and then made worse. If you owned a Volkswagen, Audi, Seat or Skoda with the EA189 diesel, the 1.6 or 2.0 TDI fitted to millions of UK cars, you were part of Dieselgate. The engine management software detected when the car was undergoing an emissions test and altered combustion settings to suppress nitrogen oxide output for the duration. In real-world driving, it reverted to settings producing up to 40 times the permitted NOx. VW admitted it. That much is not disputed. What followed was a software fix applied to 1.2 million UK vehicles. Complaints from owners after that fix include noticeably worsened fuel economy, broken exhaust gas recirculation valves, and clogged particulate filters. Volkswagen maintained that no systemic issue in respect of impaired performance had been identified. A report submitted by the Volkswagen Diesel Customer Forum stated that owners of fixed 2.0-litre cars had also noticed increased exhaust smoke, excessive DPF regeneration and DPF failure, along with failed EGR valves, turbochargers and injectors. The mechanism is not mysterious. Changes to the injection system, combined with heavier use of the EGR valve, made the engine produce more particulate matter. More particulate means more regeneration cycles. More regeneration cycles shorten the life of a very expensive filter. So the sequence runs: VW cheated, got caught, applied a fix that made the engine behave properly, which meant more soot. More soot, more regenerations, a filter that dies early. And in the UK, DPFs are not covered under warranty on any vehicle. They are treated as a wear item. Owners were offered no warranty following the emissions fix either. That is the structure of it. The company that created the problem also created the conditions for the next problem, charged nothing for either, and correctly calculated that most people would pay the replacement bill without tracing it back to a software update applied 18 months earlier. There is no conspiracy in that, just a rational reading of how much scrutiny a car owner applies to the connection between an ECU flash and a blocked filter. If you are still here, that is more than most people manage, and there is something worth your time in the next section. Because the turbocharger story is going to change how you think about oil change intervals. Subscribe if you want more of this, nothing flashy, just the actual numbers. Turbocharger failure accounts for 14% of UK engine failure quote requests. The turbo is usually not the thing that fails first. Core failure tends to be the consequence of something else. Oil contamination, oil starvation, excessive heat, all of which strip the turbo of the lubrication and cooling it depends on. Here is why that matters. Turbos spin at over 100,000 RPM and need extremely precise bearings to do it without friction or heat buildup. At those speeds, the bearing surfaces are kept apart by a film of oil measured in microns, not a cushion, a film. If that film is interrupted by contaminated oil, by oil broken down past its service point, by a partially blocked pickup, the surfaces touch. At 100,000 RPM, surfaces that touch do not last long. In extreme cases, parts of the turbo enter the engine, and then you are buying an engine as well as a turbo. On its own, Repairing or replacing a turbocharger runs between 450 and 3,000 tons or more. The extended service intervals built into most manufacturer schedules, 12 or 15,000 miles between oil changes, sometimes longer, exist to make ownership feel cheap and easy. Whether they are appropriate for a bearing that needs clean oil at all times is a different question. I am not saying the manufacturer is wrong. I am saying the turbo does not care what the service booklet says. It cares about the oil actually circulating through it. My experience, and this is an observation rather than a peer-reviewed figure, is that turbocharged engines benefit from oil changes at around 10,000 miles or annually, whichever comes first, regardless of the book. Keep the oil clean and a turbo will run a very long time. Let it run to maximum interval repeatedly, and you are taking a chance. The fourth failure type is the one I flagged at the start, the Land Rover SDV6 crankshaft. The Discovery 4 and Range Rover Sport are icons of British engineering, but owners of the 3.0-litre SDV6 diesel face a unique and frustrating problem: crankshaft snapping. Unlike a part that wears out slowly, SDV6 crankshaft failure often happens with no prior warning, usually while cruising at motorway speed. The crankshaft is the spine of the engine. It converts the up and down motion of the pistons into rotation. Without it, nothing moves. When one physically fractures, the engine stops. Not gracefully, immediately, violently, and without the slightest further use. The car becomes a large, expensive obstacle. While the SDV6 solved some earlier timing chain issues, a new threat emerged: crankshaft bearing failure caused by inadequate oil pressure at low RPM. That particularly affects stop-start driving, which is most of urban Britain. The root cause traces to a faulty pressure relief valve, allowing oil to bypass the bearings during frequent low-speed operation. Land Rover never issued a full recall, but Technical Service Bulletin LTB0487 from 2013 acknowledged increased bearing wear under high-load conditions, particularly in vehicles used for towing or off-roading. Think about what that sentence contains. Land Rover knew in 2013 that these bearings wore under high load. The Discovery 4 and Range Rover Sport were sold specifically to people who tow things and go off-road. A technical service bulletin is an internal document, not a public notice, not a recall. It acknowledged the wear and recommended updated components, and many vehicles never received the updated oil pump assembly under campaign reference LTB0689. On cost: if the crankshaft snaps, Land Rover main dealers typically recommend a brand new crate engine, which can run over 12,000 tons. A full rebuild is $5,000 to $8,000. Early diagnosis often allows crankshaft regrinding or targeted replacement at significantly lower cost. The warnings exist, but they are easy to miss. Symptoms begin subtly: a slight vibration through the cabin at idle, then metallic knocking under acceleration. By the time warning lights come on, the bearing surfaces have often scored the journals beyond repair. If you own one, the specific thing to check is whether the updated oil pump assembly has been fitted. You will not know that from a service history unless it is explicitly noted. A Land Rover specialist, not necessarily a main dealer, can check it against the VIN. Now, the Ford EcoBoost, specifically the 1.0-litre three-cylinder fitted to the Fiesta, Focus, Puma and others that became some of the best-selling cars in the country. The UK has over 700,000 vehicles running the wet belt EcoBoost petrol engine, more than anywhere else in Europe. A wet belt, or belt-in oil system, is exactly what it sounds like. Instead of sitting dry behind a plastic cover, the timing belt lives inside the engine, permanently bathed in oil. The idea is sound. Running the timing drive in oil means no external lubrication, less friction loss, a more compact engine. The engineers were not stupid. The problem is, what happens to rubber? Sitting in hot oil through thousands of heating and cooling cycles over several years. The compound degrades. As it does, the belt sheds material that clogs the oil pickup strainer, starving the engine of lubrication. In severe cases, the belt skips teeth or snaps entirely, and then you have valve-to-piston contact, valves moving down into the cylinder, colliding with a piston moving up at engine speed. Bent valves, damaged pistons, engine finished. Ford originally described the belt as lifetime, requiring no scheduled replacement. Guidance has since been revised. Ford now recommend replacement after 10 years or 150,000 miles, which, given the failure record, most specialists consider far too long. Real-world data shows failures occurring between 60,000 and 100,000 miles. Less than half the promised durability. Here is a documented case. One couple spent $15,000 on a 4-year-old Focus with 50,000 miles and full service history. Engine failure left them with a $3,000 bill, which Ford refused to cover because the car had been serviced by an independent garage. Sit with that detail, as though the failure was caused by not using a Ford dealer rather than by a rubber component dissolving in hot oil, while Ford told everybody it was a lifetime fit. What makes this particularly insidious is the silence of it. Many owners get no warning symptoms at all before catastrophic failure. Some garages now recommend replacing wet belts every 4 to 5 years or 40,000 miles, far earlier than Ford's guidance. That is the real interval, derived from what workshops are actually seeing fail, rather than from what keeps warranty costs down. Preventative replacement is around $1,500, including VAT, parts and lubricants. Owners who leave it report engine replacements over $5,000. The arithmetic is straightforward. Either you know about this and plan for it, or you do not and pay 5 to 10 times as much when it decides for you. Let me stop, because something in this picture needs naming clearly. Every engine on this list is a version of the same story. A design decision was made, reasonable at least on paper. The chain goes at the back for packaging. The wet belt removes external friction loss. The long drain interval reduces running costs. The decision carried a downstream cost. The downstream cost landed on the person who bought the car. And the gap between the people who made the decision and the person paying for it is the real product being managed here. Nobody in a boardroom plotted to extract $5,000 from Focus owners. What happened is that the cost of a recall, a redesign, and a public acknowledgement was weighed against the cost of leaving things alone and issuing quiet, updated guidance later. The guidance came, eventually, worded to minimize any suggestion that something had been wrong. That gap between what they knew and when they told you is where most of these bills come from. And knowing it exists is what turns the service desk conversation from something happening to you into something you are part of. Now, the Mercedes OM651, the 2.1-litre diesel, produced from 2008, powering numerous C-Class, E-Class, Vito and Sprinter models. A genuinely capable unit in many respects. The failure that brought it to attention here is called Black Death. It is a fuel injector problem, specifically the seals. The name comes from the thick black carbon buildup that appears around the injector. The copper sealing washers degrade over time under heat and pressure. Once a seal fails, combustion gases escape past it and bake carbon around the injector body and seat. Here is where it escalates. If ignored, injectors become stuck in the head, and removal turns difficult and expensive. Leave it long enough, and the seat itself may need careful cleaning or recutting. The symptom is visible black residue around the injector bodies. You can often see it without taking anything apart, looking along the top of the engine with a torch. A chuffing noise under load, rough idle, or harder starting also point to early seal failure. Engines built after 2014, with updated injectors and timing components, are considerably more reliable. If you own a pre-2014 OM651 with over 80,000 miles, budget for injector or timing chain work. There is also a problem affecting a huge number of modern petrol engines that is almost never mentioned at the point of sale. Direct injection carbon buildup. In older port injection engines, fuel was sprayed onto the back of the intake valve on every cycle, and the detergents in petrol kept the valve face clean. On a direct injection engine, fuel never touches the intake valve. Oil vapor from the crankcase ventilation system settles on the hot valve face instead, bakes on, and builds into a rough porous coating that restricts airflow, disrupts mixture formation, and eventually causes misfires and power loss. Industry data suggests severe by 15 to 25%. The fix at a serious stage is walnut blasting. Crushed walnut shells fired at the valve faces through the intake ports once the manifold is off. It works. It is not ruinously expensive, and it requires somebody to know the job needs doing. Most service schedules do not mention it. More frequent oil changes slow the deposit rate. Fuel additives may help, though I will be honest that the evidence there is mixed, and quality varies enormously between products. Two more, briefly. The Vauxhall 1.9 TDI found in the Astra, Vectra and Zafira has a well-documented head gasket failure pattern. On this one, I want to be careful about specific timelines because my data is less precise than for the BMW and Land Rover cases. What I can say is that any used example over 80,000 miles warrants a cooling system pressure test and a combustion gas check before purchase. Slight white smoke on cold start that clears quickly, slow coolant loss with no visible leak, sweet-smelling exhaust, easy symptoms to dismiss, which is exactly why they are worth naming, and the Nissan diesel fitted to early Qashqais and X-Trails, innovative on paper, problematic in practice. Timing chain tensioner issues dominate its failure record, and the symptom is again that cold start rattle. The difference from the N47 is that the chain is front-mounted and far more accessible, which brings repair costs down considerably. But access does not fix an underlying tensioner design, and it does not help you if the rattle has been there a year before anyone acted. Here is something concrete to take away. A procedure, not a rule of thumb. If you are buying used, listen to the car cold before it has been run that morning. A rattle that quietens in the first 3 to 10 seconds and then disappears is a timing chain under stress. Reject it or price the repair into your offer. Ask specifically whether the wet belt has been replaced on any Ford EcoBoost built before 2020 and do not accept that it is fine. Ask for the invoice. On any Land Rover SDV6, ask for the VIN to be checked against the updated oil pump campaign. On a Mercedes OM651, look along the top of the engine for black residue around the injectors. 5-minute checks, each worth potentially thousands of pounds. If you already own one of these, the chain rattle is what I would act on first. Every day you drive on a stretched chain that knocks at startup is a day closer to the point where the preventative cost becomes the catastrophic one. An engine-out chain job is 30 to 45 hours of labour, 3 to 5 days in the workshop. That is money you are not spending today, but it is money that roughly doubles, sometimes triples, the longer you wait. On the DPF, if you are doing mostly short trips, have a forced regeneration done once a year, or at the first sign of a warning light. That is the garage, plugging into the diagnostics and running a controlled high-temperature burn. A partially blocked filter very often does not need replacing at all, and in the UK, that service typically costs between $80 and $200 on the turbo. If your schedule allows oil changes past 10,000 miles, ignore it and change at 10. Use the grade specified in the owner's manual, not the grade that was on offer, not the grade the fast fit place defaulted to, the specified grade. Thin oils approved for modern engines look wrong to anyone who started on older cars, but they are correct for the clearances these engines are built to. Going heavier, because it feels safer, can actually restrict flow to the turbo bearings. On the EA189, if you took the fix and your car then developed EGR or DPF problems, the legal landscape is complicated. More than 40,000 UK owners have joined a class action against Volkswagen over Dieselgate. Whether that produces anything useful for any individual owner is genuinely uncertain. The pace is slow and the outcomes variable. What I will say is that the case for a connection between the update and the subsequent failures is difficult to argue against when you look at the mechanism. The EGR runs harder after the fix. A harder running EGR produces more soot. More soot clogs the filter faster. That is cause and effect, not coincidence. The million failure figure is real in the sense that it reflects genuine documented failures from real quotes, real workshop records, real cars that stopped working. It is not a cumulative total across all time. It is the current running rate, the shape of what is failing right now on British roads. Most of it was not inevitable. It was the downstream consequence of specific decisions about tensioner specifications, belt material grades, and what interval would keep the warranty department comfortable while quietly moving the long-term cost to the person at the other end of the driveway. None of that requires a villain. It requires ordinary commercial logic applied to components the owner will never see until they fail. Knowing what that logic is puts you on the other side of it. The chain rattle is not a noise to mention at the next service. The DPF light is not an annoyance to clear with a long motorway run. The knock at idle in the Land Rover is not something to bring up whenever it next goes in. These are specific, timed warnings with specific, documented consequences, and they arrive faster than most people expect. The goal is simple. Keep the thing running. Know what it needs, and be the person in the conversation who has already looked at the numbers, rather than the one hearing them for the first time across a service desk. If you have had one of these on your own car, the N47 rattle, the EcoBoost belt, the VW fix making things worse, anything else covered here, put it in the comments. What it was, what it cost, whether you got any help from the manufacturer or whether you were on your own with it. I go through them all. And the specifics matter. The model year, the mileage it happened at, the gap between the manufacturer's guidance and when the failure actually turned up. All of that builds a picture more useful than any single data set. And anyone about to disagree with the Volkswagen section is welcome to it, genuinely. Bring the counter-argument. If there is evidence that the software update did not affect EGR wear rates, I have not seen it, and I am not claiming to have seen everything. There is more behind this too. The turbocharger picture is part of a broader trend. Smaller, hotter, more highly stressed engines being asked to do work that larger ones used to do with far more margin. And I have not fully pulled on that thread yet. When I do, it connects to a set of problems in modern petrol engines that almost nobody selling you a car wants you thinking about before you sign. Stay curious about what is under there.